Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Delve. Today we're taking a break from our major projects to get a little more familiar with GameMaker Studio 2. That's right, originally I planned to learn the ins and outs a little better before making actual content with the program, but I thought it'd be funnier to document my first steps into GameMaker Studio 2 so we can all laugh at my noobness in the future. You know, when I learn nothing and make the same mistakes over and over again. Self-burn. Anyway, the plan for today is simple. Make a very basic top-down tower defense game with an enemy, a turret, and some interactivity. Anything extra is a plus, and really, this is more of an exercise than anything, so we're simply aiming for the bare minimum here. So like the bright-eyed, hopeful devs that we are, let's get to the coding. I decided to focus on the enemy first, starting with the sprite, and figuring out the whole new layout of GameMaker Studio 2. It took a bit, but I eventually got to our enemy for the project. A really angry turtle. You can tell it's angry because it's red, and it's angry eyes. Look at those angry eyes. Next, I set up the room. With the knowledge that cameras and views changed, I knew there was a lot more to setting things up, but oh boy, did I underestimate just how much has changed between versions, and I'll get to more on that in a bit. But with the view and the room set up, I needed a background that would lay out our defensive scene. I crudely drew a windy trench of water and some sand, trying to keep in mind that, you know, we need to place turrets later on. It kind of worked out alright. Next, I set up our camera, which luckily we don't have to tinker with since our camera for this project is static. And so far so good. So next I decided to figure out how paths work in GMS 2. Spoilers, they really changed paths up, and damn if the documentation did not help in the slightest in figuring this out. In GameMaker Studio 1, you can load backgrounds into the path editor to make setting up static paths easier. But that's not the case in GameMaker Studio 2. No, instead that's done through the room editor, requiring a path layer to then map it out like the old days. And I only figured this out because I started desperately clicking on things hoping that the feature even still existed, because again, the documentation doesn't make things clear, like at all. Anyway, with our path plotted, I added the code needed to have our enemies follow the proper path. Next, I had to figure out how to spawn things. Yeah, so GMS 2's layer system is clearly a new gimmick I'm going to need to learn, because having to define whether objects are created on layers or depths really threw me for a loop. Eventually I settled on depth because I still don't fully understand the point of layers at the moment. Moving on, I created a trigger point for the end of the path that would destroy any enemies that reach it. I also tweaked the enemies to face the direction it's moving, and finally, after about 30 minutes of stumbling, I managed to spawn enemies at the start of the path, have those enemies follow said path to the end, and get deleted at the end of the path. All while featuring some of the best placeholder art of all time. But alas, we were only halfway there, so it was time to create our turrets. And what better type of turret to face off with the turtle than the shell. Bright pink coral shells to be exact. I started by adding a cooldown on creation of the turret, then I moved on to keeping track of targets. Using code we've used in a lot of previous projects worked just fine here. Oh, kind of. I mean, it did work, but I forgot a few expressions, which GMS 2 was glad to point out, only on the wrong lines. Yeah, I forgot to add X and Y to the instance nearest check, but GMS 2 made it seem like there was something wrong with the distance check. 5 minutes of fumbling later, I got it, and we finally had code for a turret to face nearby enemies. 45 minutes to get this far, folks. Woo! Next, we needed some projectiles for these turrets to fire. And of course, I went with pearls, because shells, pearls, seem to fit. Does that make me shellist? Anyway, I set up pearl projectiles like I do most projectiles, have it move in a distance yet to be defined on creation, and if it hits a vulnerable enemy, do a health check and either destroy it or set it up for more pain to come. And to top it off, some added quick flash effect for that extra pizzazz. So moving on back to the turret using the depth creation code, I set it up so that not only will turrets fire if they have a target and aren't on cooldown, but they also fire projectiles in the direction that they are facing. Again, nothing too new here other than the creation bit, but yeah, we finally managed to create the basics of a tower defense game. But I wanted to do one extra little thing before calling it a day, and that was turret creation. So I created 2 new instances, the first being a way to restrict building in certain places, and a cursor object to make keeping track of the mouse activity easier. Using the room editor, I plotted out the restricted areas with several of the restrictive objects. This was actually the first time I realized the potential with layers, however I was under a time crunch at this point, so I wasn't able to experiment. After plotting out the restricted areas, I moved on to the cursor. I created 2 variations of the cursor that would give visual feedback as to whether or not we can place a turret. And code-wise, there wasn't much to it. I first checked to make sure that the cursor wasn't in a restricted area. If it was all good and we weren't also placed over an existing turret, then create a turret in that spot. I would have gone with grid placement, but given how awkwardly that trench turned out, I opted not to give myself that extra headache. So there we have it, my first project done in GameMaker Studio 2. The very basics of your typical tower defense game, most of which should have taken, like half the time, but, learning and stuff. I was actually surprised that the new workflow in GMS 2 works pretty well, and I think once I learn where everything is, things should go much more smoothly. But for now, that's the end of this episode of Let's Dev. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our project in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.